A widow stood at the mouth of a crack in the mountain and stepped into the dark. Behind her, a whole valley had already decided she was finished. They had handed her a letter and a fistful of coins. They had called her mad, and then they had turned their faces away and left her alone with a closing season and a house that was no longer hers. Now the wind came down off the ridge with a cold so clean it felt like breathing broken glass. And somewhere below, in thin-walled houses built too cheap to hold a life, children were beginning to shiver. She had only one thing left in all the world: a small brown book, the handwriting of a man they had already buried, and a single line written in his careful hand that promised warmth where no warmth could possibly be. She did not yet know that the people who cast her out would one day climb this frozen mountain, cold and desperate, and beg her to save them. She only knew the crack in the rock was warm, and that she was going in. A widow stood alone in the doorway of a house that had already stopped belonging to her. The wind came down off the ridge with a cold so clean it felt like breathing broken glass. It pressed against the thin pine walls. It searched out every seam and every gap. And it carried with it the quiet warning the high country always gives before it closes, that winter was coming, and winter would not knock. Her name was Marlowe Ashcombe, 38 years old, a face shaped by thin air and hard mornings, eyes that had learned over many winters how to hold bad news without breaking. She saw the boy long before he reached her porch. He came up the packed dirt lane with his shoulders curved inward, the way a person stands when he is carrying something he wishes he could put down and walk away from. He could not have been more than 16, still soft in the cheeks, not yet old enough to know how to deliver sorrow without flinching from it. He held the envelope out at arm's length, as though the paper might scald his fingers. She took it from him gently, and his eyes went everywhere but her face, to the rail, to the pale sky, to the bare branches of the single cottonwood at the edge of the yard. She already understood. She understood before her thumb ever touched the seal. She waited until his footsteps faded down the lane. Only then did she step back inside and close the door behind her. The house was cold. It had been cold for a long time now. Not only in the way a thermometer measures, it was cold in the way a room goes hollow when the person who once filled it has been carried out and not brought back. Weston Ashcombe had gone into that mountain strong. For 11 years he had gone in strong, and for 11 years he had come home covered in the fine gray dust of the deep levels, smelling of stone and cold and honest work. And then, one ordinary morning, the mountain shifted its enormous shoulders and decided his labor was done. The men who came to tell her had used a careful word, a miscalculation. One tidy word, meant to sit in the space where a living man used to be, as if any word could ever be large enough to fill it. She sat down at the kitchen table. He had built that table himself from 2 rough planks the first spring they came to this place. She could still see the marks of his plane in the wood if she looked. She did not look. She reached instead for the small paring knife and opened the envelope along its edge. Her hands did not shake. Her hands never shook. Inside was the language of men who have never once lifted a pick. Polite, measured, emptied of everything human but the faint perfume of courtesy. It offered its sympathy in a single sentence, the way one might mention a change in the weather. And then it came to the point. 14 days to leave the house. A final payment enclosed. A small figure. The company's honest opinion of what a lifetime of a man's labor was worth. Now that the man was no longer standing there to give more of it, she read the letter twice. Then she folded it back along its own creases and set it beside a coffee cup she had not yet had the heart to fill. She did not weep. Instead, she looked up at the wall above the stove, at the fine web of cracks in the whitewash she had memorized across 12 years of quiet mornings, and she found her mind already doing arithmetic she had never asked it to do. 11 years of a life, reduced to a handful of coins. That was the sum the world was offering her, but she would not let the anger take hold. Anger was a fire that devoured its own fuel and gave back no warmth. Her father had taught her that. A carpenter, a patient man, who believed you must always measure what a thing can carry before you ask it to hold your weight. So she measured her own situation plank by plank. She was 38, strong in the back, steady in the hands, but not a girl anymore, and it was girls who were hired in towns like this. There was no family left to write to. A brother somewhere out west who had stopped answering years ago, and a season already tightening around the valley like a slow, closing fist. Every ordinary road led to the same quiet ending. She saw this clearly, the way she saw the frost on the window, without flinching and without pretending it was something else. And then came a second knock, not the timid knock of a frightened boy. This one was heavier, sure of itself, the knock of a man accustomed to doors opening for him. She rose and opened it. Cormac Thorne stood on her porch in a fine wool coat that had never once known the dust of the shaft. His was the signature at the bottom of the letter she had just folded. He was the man who ran the mine as though the men inside it were only parts, to be used while useful, and swept aside when they were not. He took off his hat. He arranged his features into something meant to resemble sympathy. "Mrs. Ashcombe," he said, "a terrible loss, a terrible thing." She said nothing at all. A woman alone. She shouldn't have to face a winter with no roof. He went on, lowering his voice into a softer register. "There might be a place for you. Light work at the office. A warm room through the cold months. All it would ask of you is that the past be allowed to stay in the past." The words hung in the freezing air between them, and she heard, quite plainly, the thing living beneath them say nothing about how her husband had truly died. Ask no questions. Sign whatever was placed before her, and in exchange, they would loan her back a small corner of the warmth they had already taken away. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he began to shift his weight from one polished boot to the other. Then she closed the door, softly, without a single raised word, the way a person closes a book whose ending they already know. And she stood there in the cold of the hallway, listening to his careful footsteps go back down the steps, back toward the town that answered to him, and had never once answered to her. The house fell quiet again. 14 days, a few coins, no family, and a whole mountain of winter leaning down against the valley. For perhaps 30 seconds, she let herself feel the entire weight of it. the dizzying drop of a life reduced to a column of numbers with no good answer waiting at the bottom. Then she set the feeling down, because a fact was only ever a place to begin, never a place to end. She rose and walked into the bedroom toward the task she had been avoiding for months now, the folding of his clothes, the quiet work of letting her hands confirm what her heart had long refused to. His worn shirts, his spare boots by the wall, his good coat still hanging on its peg as though he might reach for it that evening. She folded each thing with the same care she gave to everything she touched, and then she came to the small shelf above his side of the bed. Company manuals, mostly. Dry books, full of dry columns. But there, wedged between two of them, her fingers found something softer. A small book, bound in dark brown leather, worn smooth from years of handling. No title stamped upon the spine. She knew it the moment she touched it. She had watched him bend over it 100 evenings, under the lamp, long after supper, his pen moving in that careful, self-taught hand. He had called it his noticing book, not the logs he surrendered to the company. This was the other one, the private one, the place where he wrote down what the mountain looked like when a man gave it his whole attention, instead of only weighing it for what it could be made to give up. She lowered herself onto the edge of the bed, and she opened it. The pages were crowded with his script, sketches of rock and root and drifting snow, notes on the way the light fell across the high passes in the failing part of the year. So much thinking he had done here, in the quiet hours while she slept, in a country of his own, she had never quite been invited into. She turned the pages slowly, and something in her chest ached with the nearness of him. Then she stopped. At the top of one page, written in letters larger than all the rest, were 5 words that would quietly unmake everything she believed about the days in front of her. She read them once, then she read them again, and for the first time since they had carried him down from the mountain, the cold in the room seemed to draw back just a little, as though something deep inside her had begun, very softly, to burn. Cold Spire Ridge, South Face, Fisher. 5 words written in his careful hand at the top of the page. She stared at them, and beneath them she found a drawing, not a rough sketch, not the kind of thing a man scribbles to pass an evening. This was rendered with the focused precision he gave only to things that had truly seized his attention. A vertical crack in a granite cliff face, a heavy curtain of old juniper growing directly out of the stone, half hiding the opening, and below the drawing, his notes. She read them the way a person reads a letter from someone they thought they had lost for good. He had measured the fissure, perhaps 30 feet deep, 3 feet across at its widest. The entrance faced due south, he had written, which meant it would catch the low winter sun straight on, from mid-morning to mid-afternoon. Beyond the narrow passage, he wrote, the space opened into a larger chamber, 8 feet across, 14, maybe 15 feet deep, a ceiling that rose from 6 feet at the mouth to more than 10 at the back wall, and high on that back wall, a second, smaller crack. A natural chimney, he called it. Slow, steady air moving through it, enough to keep the moisture out. Then came the sentences she would read 4 more times before she rose from that bed. The granite here is dense, stable, no active fracturing, The stone holds an immense mass of warmth, hundreds of tons of it, and with the south-facing mouth catching the low winter light, the rock drinks in the sun by day and gives it slowly back through the long nights. Even on the bitterest day, he had written, the inner chamber would hold well above freezing, with no fire at all, and with a small stove and a proper chimney. The place could be made genuinely warm, genuinely livable. Then the last line. Nature has done the engineering here. It asks only for a person with enough attention to see what it has already built. Below that, a small map, a lightning-struck pine marked as the landmark, 200 paces due west from its base, keeping the ridgeline at the right shoulder, watching for the heavy curtain of juniper on the granite shelf. She sat very still. Her thumb moved along the edge of the page, feeling the faint grooves where his pen had pressed hard into the paper. He had written all of this long before the mountain took him. He had written it not for her, not for anyone. He had written it because he was the kind of man who noticed things, because the noticing itself had value to him, whether or not another living soul ever read a word of it. He could not have known. He could not have known that his wife would one day sit on the edge of their bed with 14 days and a fistful of coins, and a season closing hard around her, holding in her hands the one thing in all the world that offered a third road, not the city, where a woman alone and no longer young would burn through her small money and end on the street, not the town, where every household was already stretched past breaking. A third road, and then she noticed something else. The bottom corner of the page had been torn, not cut, torn. A ragged edge where the last lines of his final entry should have continued. Something had been written there, and something had taken it away. She ran her finger along the rough edge. Whatever he had written at the very end of that page, whatever last thing he had meant to say, it was gone. She closed the book slowly, and for a long moment she simply sat, listening to the wind work at the walls, finding the gaps around the window frame, showing her with quiet patience how little stood between the inside of that house and the enormous cold beyond it. He had been gone 4 months, but his knowledge had not gone with him. The thought did not arrive as comfort. It arrived as information, clean and useful and precise, the way a measurement arrives. Weston Ashcombe had left her a blueprint. Whether it was enough, she could not know from this bedroom. She would have to go and see for herself. She left before first light the next morning. She told no one. She had thought of telling the one man in town she halfway trusted, but decided against it. If the fissure was not what her husband had described, if his estimates were wrong, if the way up proved impossible, she did not want a witness to the failure. She would go. She would look, she would return, and decide. The air at that hour, before the sun cleared the eastern peaks, was not merely cold. It had weight. It had the quality of something that would not yield to the warmth of a human body without demanding something in return. She moved through it at a steady, unhurried pace. Her father had called it working speed. Not slow, not rushed. The pace at which a person could labor across an entire day without burning through their strength before the work was done. She crossed the sleeping town while its thin walls still held the dark inside them. She followed the frozen creek westward. And when the creek curved away from the ridge, she began to climb. The first stretch ran through a dense stand of pine on the shadowed north slope. The ground there was frozen hard. A dusting of early snow had settled into the hollows between the rocks, and the footing was treacherous, and she gave it her full attention. She climbed for an hour, and then the pines thinned and the grade steepened, and she came to a small saddle between two granite shoulders, exactly where his map had promised it would be. She crossed it, and the world changed. On the north side, shadow and frost and the smell of frozen earth. On the south side, the sun had already cleared the peaks and struck the slope at a low, slanting angle. Not warmth exactly, but the memory of warmth. The suggestion of it held in the pale, dry grass. The heavy pines gave way to trees standing wide and generous, their bark a warm reddish-brown in the early light. Juniper grew from the cracks in the granite, its berries a dusty blue against the dark green. She paused there at the saddle and looked back down at the valley. From this height, the town revealed its true nature with an uncomfortable clarity. A cluster of identical little houses, the dark scar of the waste rock spilling down the slope below the mine. All of it arranged around a single purpose that had nothing at all to do with the people who served it. She had lived inside that arrangement for 12 years. She had never once stepped far enough outside of it to see its actual shape. She turned back to the slope, and she climbed on. The lightning-struck pine stood exactly where he had drawn it. A great tree, its top 30 feet blasted into a spear of pale splintered wood, bone-white against the morning sky. From its base, she began to count her paces, keeping the ridgeline close on her right, just as he had written, watching the granite face ahead for the curtain of juniper. At 190 paces, she saw it, a dense, tangled wall of dark green growing directly out of a shelf of granite, grown, it almost seemed, for the single purpose of hiding whatever lay behind it. At 200 paces exactly, she stopped, and she stood there, looking at it. From where she stood, it was impenetrable. There was no opening. Nothing to suggest the stone behind those branches was anything other than solid cliff. If her husband had been a lesser observer, a man who let his enthusiasm stretch his measurements, this was the moment his directions would have failed her. The distance would have been wrong. The juniper would have been the wrong juniper. The crack in the rock would have been the ordinary kind that led nowhere at all. She reached out. She pushed aside a heavy, fragrant branch, and she laid her bare hand against the granite behind it. Her fingers found the edge of the fissure before her eyes had even adjusted to the dimness. Exactly as he had drawn it, 3 feet across, running straight up the cliff, darker than the surrounding stone, cooler. And out of it came a faint, steady breath of air, as though the mountain itself were slowly exhaling. She turned sideways, and she stepped in. The first 10 feet pressed close against both her shoulders at once. The rock was rough-grained and cold, but not wet, not seeping the way she had feared. She moved forward carefully, her feet finding the uneven floor, her hands reading the walls in the fading light. And then the walls stepped back. She came to a stop in the larger chamber and stood very still, letting her eyes gather what little light there was. The south-facing mouth admitted a single shaft of morning sun. It reached perhaps 8 feet into the space, lighting the front of it with that sharp, clear, high country light, flat, without heat, but full of a strange clarity. The back of the chamber receded into a shadow her eyes only slowly learned to read. The ceiling was a single, enormous slab of granite, the kind of thing that is made over millions of years and cannot be built or bought, only found. It rose at the back wall to what she guessed was 10 feet and sloped gently toward the entrance. The floor was level. Remarkably, almost impossibly level for something no hand had made. Packed earth mixed with granite dust, solid beneath her boots. She walked to the back wall. High above, where the ceiling met the stone, the second crack angled up and disappeared into the mountain. She wet a finger and held it near the opening. The moisture cooled on the side facing the crack, then the other side, then back again. Slow, faint, but there. Air was moving through it. Not much. Enough. She pressed her open palm flat against the granite and held it there. The stone was cold. Of course it was cold. This rock had been drinking in and giving back the seasons for longer than there had been anyone to feel it. A mass so vast that a whole summer had shifted its temperature only by a fraction. But beneath the cold, she felt the promise of it, the dryness, the density, the absolute, patient stillness of a thing that was not merely a wall, but a great battery of warmth, waiting only to be charged. He had been right about all of it, the orientation, the dimensions, the air, the quality of the stone. He had been right with the precision he gave to everything he had ever truly loved. Not the precision of a man trying to impress anyone. The precision of a man who understood that accuracy was a form of kindness to whoever might come after him. She stood in that chamber for a long time, turning slowly, measuring it all with her eyes, and her mind was already moving through the work ahead. The chamber was too large to heat with a small stove. She would have to make it smaller. A wall, a partition of dry stacked stone, 4 feet high, dividing the deep, warm space at the back from the cold mouth near the entrance. The wall would not need to reach the ceiling. It would only need to interrupt the cold air, to make a break between the living space and the outside. She had watched stonemasons work as a girl. She had absorbed the principles without ever knowing she was absorbing them. The stove would sit at the back, beneath the natural chimney, a door of some kind at the mouth, and wood. She would need an enormous quantity of wood, enough to burn through months without stopping. She took the noticing book from her coat pocket. She opened it to his entry and read the last unbroken line once more. Nature has done the engineering here. It asks only for a person with enough attention to see what it has already built. And then her eyes went, again, to that torn corner, to the missing words. She stood there in the cold and clean-smelling dark, and a small unease settled in her chest. He had written something more. She was certain of it now. Something he had thought important enough to place at the very end. But the mountain does not wait for a person to feel certain. She had come up to learn whether a third road existed. She had her answer. What remained now was to walk it, with enough speed and care and intelligence to be inside and ready before the season sealed the mountain shut. She took one last slow look. She marked the dimensions in her memory. Then she turned and moved back through the narrow passage, out through the curtain of juniper, into the full light of the morning. Behind her, the branches fell closed again over the entrance. A person passing below would see nothing but cliff and old green growth, the ordinary face of the high country. The town was waking when she came down off the slope. There was one place she needed to go before she did anything else. A small store at the western edge of the settlement, run by a man named Barnaby Rourke. Barnaby did not ask questions. That was the first thing she had understood about him years ago. He was a man who had spent his whole life in a trade built on other people's needs, and somewhere in all those years, he had learned that need carried its own dignity, that the kindest thing you could do for a person who required something was to help them get it without ever making them explain why. He was behind his counter when she pushed through the door, entering figures into a ledger with a stub of pencil. He looked up. He took in the early hour, the canvas coat, the fact that she carried nothing. He set the pencil down. She placed both her palms flat on the counter. "I have a list," she said. Her voice carried the particular evenness of a woman who has decided that clarity is the only kind of speed available to her. "I need everything on it. Today." He pulled a fresh sheet toward him, and she went through the list without a single moment's hesitation, because she had been building it in her head since she stepped out of that chamber, refining it the whole way down the mountain, cutting away everything that was a comfort rather than a necessity. A small cast iron stove, the lighter of the two on his shelf, the better made one. Lengths of stovepipe with elbows to turn the corners, a shovel with a straight-grained handle, a pick because the frozen ground would not give up its stone without persuasion, a saw with a spare blade because the blade she started the winter with would not be the blade she finished it with. Then the food, chosen for how long it would last and how much it would give back, not for variety. Flour, beans, a slab of salt pork, lard, salt, coffee. Because she was a grown woman and there were limits to the hardship she would ask of herself. Matches, and cartridges for the rifle that had been her husband's, and was now hers. Because winter at that height meant taking what the mountain offered, not what a store could stock. Barnaby tallied it in short, deliberate strokes. She counted out her coins. He set them aside without counting them back at her, which was its own quiet form of respect. Then he put down his pencil, he came around the counter, and he walked into the back room without a word of explanation. She heard him moving things, the heavy scrape of crates across the floorboards. When he returned, he carried a folded wool blanket, thick and gray, and a large square of canvas, treated with oil, still faintly waxy to the touch. He set them on the counter between them. "Found these clearing out the back," he said. "Damaged lot. Can't sell them as new." A pause, the particular pause of a man deciding how much of what he means to actually say. "Call it a small price for the pair." The blanket was worth many times what he named. The oiled canvas, more than that. She looked at the goods. Then she looked at him. He was not looking at her with pity. That was the one thing she could not have taken. He was looking at the middle distance between them with the plain expression of a man completing a transaction. "You're Weston," he said, and his voice dropped to a register that was not quite private and not quite public. "He pulled my boy out of a snow gap on the pass road one winter. Only other soul on that road at that hour. My boy would have been stiff by morning." A beat. The high country looks after its own. She paid the small price. He added a whetstone and a paper sack of nails to the box without comment, the way a person sets a glass of water beside someone who has not asked for it. He helped her load it all onto the little two-wheeled handcart he kept for customers, fitting the stove into the center for balance. "Bring the cart back when you're done with it," he said. Not a question, not a condition, a simple statement of expectation. The quiet implication being that he fully expected her to be in a position, someday, to bring it back. It was the most useful thing anyone had said to her in 4 months. The cart could not go where she was going. She understood that before she even reached the creek. The last of the way was too steep, too broken. She would have to carry everything up in stages, which meant she had to think carefully about the order of it, what was knighted first, and what could wait. The stove was the most essential single thing. It was also the heaviest. She left the cart at the creek bank. She loaded the tools and the rope into the pack she had brought, shouldered it, and began the first of what would be many climbs that day. What followed was weeks of labor that turned everything she had assumed about her own strength into something she now simply knew. The first task was the wall. Without it, she would be trying to warm a volume of air no small stove could ever hold against the deep cold. She understood it in her father's terms. You do not heat the whole barn. You build one warm corner of the barn. And you build the corner first. The stone was on the slope below the fissure, where ages of freezing and thawing had cracked slabs from the cliff and sent them tumbling to rest in the thin soil. She needed pieces flat on 2 faces, manageable in weight, consistent enough to stack. She went down in the mornings when her strength was highest and pried them loose and tested each one before she trusted it. A stone that crumbled under the pick was useless. A stone that rang clean and held its edge was worth carrying up. The carrying was the hard part. The slope was too steep to drag them. They had to be lifted and set down, and lifted again, moved forward in stages. The way any heavy thing is moved over hard ground, by breaking the impossible into a series of possible steps. She made a sling from the rope to take some of the weight onto her body instead of her arms alone. And then, on that first day, a slab slipped, perhaps 18 inches across. It slid from her grip on the upper approach and caught the knuckle of her thumb against a fixed stone below. She did not drop it. The pain arrived as a white pulse that ran from her hand all the way to her shoulder. She stood completely still, and she counted to 10. Then, carefully, she set the stone down, and she examined the damage. The skin had split, but the joint still moved, which meant the bone was whole. She tore a strip from the hem of the second shirt she had brought up precisely for this kind of thing. She bound the knuckle tight, and she switched to favoring her other hand while the first one healed enough to trust again. And then something happened that she had not expected. The change taught her something. Relying on her left hand forced her to come at the stones from a different angle. And that angle, it turned out, spread the weight more evenly across her shoulders. It was easier, better. She kept the new technique long after her thumb had healed. Her father had told her that once, that an obstacle, properly examined, will sometimes hand you a better method than the one you would have chosen on your own. The wall took 9 days. She dry stacked it, the way she had watched the masons stack field walls when she was a girl. no mortar, nothing but the interlocking weight of the pieces holding it all together. Small fragments driven in as wedges to fill the gaps and stop the rocking. The idea was simple. The doing of it was not. She made mistakes. She tore down whole sections that had looked sound until she added another course and found they were not. And then she built them again. At the end of the 9th day, the wall stood 4 feet high and 6 feet long, dividing the chamber into the warm room where she would live, and the cold mouth where she would store everything else. She leaned her full shoulder into it. Nothing moved. She stood back and looked at it in the last of the afternoon light, this thing she had made with her own 2 hands out of the broken bones of the mountain. And she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not joy, not relief, something quieter and far more solid than either. The plain, clean satisfaction of a thing done correctly. The stove was the problem she was least sure she could solve alone. Getting it up the slope was one thing. Getting it through that narrow passage was another entirely. She thought about it through most of one long night, lying on the cold earth floor, wrapped in both her blankets, listening to the wind work against the mountain outside. And somewhere before dawn, she had her answer. She cut 2 straight lengths from a fallen tree near the base of the slope. She lashed them into a simple frame with the rope, tying cross pieces at intervals to make a kind of platform. She loaded the stove onto it, and she dragged the whole thing up the slope on that frame. The 2 poles acting as runners against the dry ground, the rope looped across her chest, leaning into it the way she had seen draft horses lean into a heavy load. On the steepest part, she had to stop and rest 3 times. The stove reached the entrance hole. Getting it through the passage was another kind of trouble. She took off the rope. She tilted the stove onto its side and fed it through the narrow throat on its edge, guiding it with her feet as she walked backward. It scraped both walls at once for the middle stretch. It fit. By a margin she did not find at all comfortable. But it fit. She built a base for it from her flattest stones, 3 courses high, as level as she could make it. She set the stove down and checked it from every angle. It did not rock. Then came the most delicate work of all, the pipe. Because a mistake here was not the kind you discovered and fixed. It was the kind that filled a chamber with poison while a person slept. She fitted the sections together with the care of someone who understood that the joint between them was not a decoration. She used both elbows to carry the pipe up toward the crack in the ceiling. She checked the route 3 times before she committed to it. The seal where the pipe passed through the rock took her the better part of a whole day. She dug the clay from a damp seep she had found a little way south of the fissure, where groundwater surfaced briefly before vanishing back into the stone. It was gray-blue and dense, with exactly the right give when she worked a little water into it. She packed it into the gap in layers, pressing each one firm before she added the next, working it into every crevice with her fingers until there was not a single opening she could find by touch or sight. She let it cure for 2 full days before she trusted it with fire. The door she built from a frame of aspen, nailed at the corners with Barnaby's nails. Nothing elegant. She was not building for elegance. She stretched the oiled canvas across it and nailed it tight, pulling the fabric taut before each nail so it would not sag. The hinges were strips cut from one of her husband's old belts, each one doubled over and nailed through both thicknesses. The door swung stiffly, but it closed against the frame on all 4 sides. She stood inside and held her hand near its edges while the wind was blowing outside. No draft against her palm, but the wood was the labor that had no end. It was not a task you finished. It was a race you ran, without stopping, until the snow itself ended the running. She became a student of the forest on the south slope. She learned its vocabulary through daily immersion. Dead-standing timber was the gold. Trees that had died on their feet, seasoned by the sun where they stood, instead of rotting on the damp ground. They rang with a different sound when she tapped them, lighter, cleaner. Their wood split with less resistance, and it burned hotter with less smoke. She felled them with the saw, watching the lean of each trunk, working the cut from the right side, thinking always about which way the tree would choose to fall. She had watched the mine's timbermen do this work for years, from a distance, absorbing the mechanics of it without ever knowing she was. Practical knowledge, she was learning, gathers quietly in the people who pay attention, whether or not they ever expect to need it. She cut the fallen trees into sections she could carry. She split the larger ones with a hatchet, and she hauled it all up to the fissure, load after load, in sizes her body could manage without harming itself. She learned to read the line between honest effort and injury, a specific tightness low in her back that came just before her muscles would fail, a burning in her shoulder that meant a different kind of trouble. When those signals came, she stopped. She rested just enough to reset, and then she went back to it. Slowly, the cold mouth of the chamber began to fill. She stacked the wood with the same care she gave to everything, the densest pieces low, where they would wait for the long overnight burns, the lighter splits above them, close to hand, and through it all she left the pile room to breathe, so the last of the moisture could keep leaving the wood, even as it sat. And through all of it, the town below said nothing. At first, she would come down for water or to return a borrowed tool to Barnaby, and she would feel the eyes on her. She would hear the sudden quiet when she passed, and she thought, at first, that it was only the ordinary distance of a town too busy surviving to concern itself with a widow. But it was more than that. She learned the truth of it one gray morning at the store. 2 women stood near the door as she came in. They did not lower their voices quite enough. The word they used was one she had heard before, spoken about others, touched, not right in the head. A poor thing, they said, who had lost her husband and then lost her senses right along with him, climbing the mountain in the cold like an animal, living in a hole in the rock. Talking, some said, to a dead man's notebook. They said someone from the company had been kind enough to offer her honest work, and she had slammed the door in his face, that she was a danger, perhaps, to herself, that someone ought to do something before the winter did it for them. She stood very still by the shelves, and in that stillness, she understood exactly what had been done to her, and by whom. Cormac Thorne had come to her porch with a soft voice and an open hand. She had closed the door on it, and a man like that could not simply let a closed door stand. So he had gone quietly to work, not with a threat. A threat could be answered. He had used something far more patient and far more cruel. He had made her strange. He had made her frightening. He had taken the one thing a woman alone truly needs in a small place, the willingness of her neighbors to see her as one of their own, and he had turned it, softly, into something else, If she was mad, then nothing she said about how her husband had died would ever be believed. If she was mad, then no one would climb that mountain to check on her. If she was mad, then she was already, in the eyes of the town, halfway gone. She set down the small thing she had come to buy. Barnaby watched her from behind the counter. He had heard the women too, and his jaw was set in a hard line she had not seen on him before. "They don't know you," he said, low. "That's all it is. People fear what they can't explain." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked out the window, up toward the ridge where the juniper hid the mouth of everything she had built. "Let them fear it," she said. Her voice was perfectly even. "A thing does not stop being true because the people below it have decided not to believe it." And she walked out into the cold, alone now in a way she had not been, even at the start. Not merely a widow without a family, a woman the whole valley had agreed, quietly, to look away from. She began the long climb back up to the one place in all the world that was hers. And behind her, unseen in the pocket of her coat, the small brown book pressed against her side, its torn page and its missing words, waiting in the dark for the moment she would need them most. The chamber was finished, or as finished as such a thing could ever be. The wall stood firm. The stove sat level on its bed of stone. The pipe rose true through the ceiling, its clay seal cured hard as the rock around it. The door held against the wind on all four sides, and the cold mouth of the fissure was filling, load by load, with the seasoned wood that would carry her through the long dark of the season. She should have felt ready, but something small kept turning over at the back of her mind, like a stone caught in a boot that a person cannot stop to shake out. The torn page. Every evening, by the low light of the fire, she opened the little brown book to his final entry. She read the last unbroken line, and her eyes went, every single time, to that ragged edge where the rest of his words should have been. He had written something more. A man that careful did not stop in the middle of a thought. He had finished it, and then that finishing had been taken away, torn clean off before the book ever reached her hands. She did not know why the thought would not leave her be, but her father had taught her to trust exactly that kind of unease. A carpenter who ignores the small wrong note in a beam, he used to say, is a carpenter who will one day stand and watch a roof come down on the people he loves. So, she did not ignore it. She simply did not yet know what to do about it. The days that followed took on a rhythm of their own. She hauled wood in the mornings when her strength ran highest. She checked the seal and the door and the stacking of the pile. She set her wire snares in the lower reaches of the slope. Below the place the snow had begun its slow advance, and twice she came back up with a rabbit, cleaned and cooked in the iron skillet, the fat as precious to her now as the meat itself. And down in the valley, the town went on, turning its face away. She felt it each time she descended for water, or to return a borrowed tool. The sudden hush when she passed, the eyes that slid away from hers, the words she had overheard at the store, passed now from porch to porch like a coin worn smooth with handling. Touched, not right in the head. The poor mad widow on the mountain. She knew whose hand had set that word in motion. A soft voice on a cold porch, and an open hand she had refused. Cormac Thorne had not been able to let that closed door stand, so he had gone quietly to work, in the way of men who never raise their voices because they have never once needed to. He had made her strange. He had taken the one thing a woman alone truly needs in a small place, the willingness of her neighbors to count her as one of their own. And he had turned it, gently, into fear. She carried that knowledge up the slope with her, load after load, and it did not break her, but it settled somewhere deep, a cold weight beneath the ribs. In the same place her grief still lived. She was not merely a widow now. She was a woman the whole valley had agreed, quietly, to look away from. It was on one of those long evenings, unable to leave the torn page alone any longer, that she carried the book to the mouth of the chamber, into the last of the failing daylight, and studied the binding itself, the way the pages were sewn, the place where the missing corner had been pulled away. And she noticed something she had missed before. The tear was not fresh. The edge of it had darkened faintly with handling, the way paper does across years. Whatever had happened to that corner, it had happened long ago, long before the mountain took him, long before the book had ever come into her keeping. He had torn it himself. The understanding arrived slowly, and it changed the shape of everything. He had not lost the last of his words. He had removed them with his own hands. He had written something at the end of that entry, and then, for reasons of his own, torn it away. Perhaps he had written it in a darker hour than he wanted her ever to see. Perhaps he had meant to find gentler words later, better ones, and hide the first attempt away until he did. Words the mountain had never given him the time to write. But a careful man does not simply destroy his own words. A careful man keeps them somewhere. She sat with that thought a long while as the light drained from the sky. And then she rose and went to the wooden crate in the cold mouth of the chamber, the one she had packed with his belongings, back in the house that was no longer hers, in what felt now like another woman's life. She had not been able to leave them behind. His worn shirts, his spare boots, the good coat. She took the coat into her hands. It was heavy, and it still smelled faintly of him, of rock dust and cold and something beneath that had only ever been his own. She ran her fingers along the seams. She checked every pocket and found them empty. And then, near the bottom hem, where the lining had worn thin and pulled loose from the wool, her fingers found the edge of something, a small folded square of paper, slipped down into the hidden space between the lining and the cloth, tucked away and forgotten, or perhaps never quite ready to be given. Her hands were not quite steady as she drew it out. Her hands, which were always steady. She unfolded it by the light of the fire. It was the missing corner, his hand, his careful, angular script. Smaller here than his usual writing, as though the words had cost him something to set down. And it was not a warning about the cold at all. It was not about the stove, or the stone, or the coming of the season. It was about her. She read it once, and then she read it again, more slowly, and the fire ticked beside her, and the wind pressed at the door. He had written that he knew her, that he had watched her all those years measure a thing 3 times before she would trust it once, that he had watched her carry more than any 2 people ought to carry, and never once ask a living soul for help. So he knew what she would do if he were gone. She would sit down at that table with a pencil. She would look at the numbers, and she would decide, in that calm and terrible way of hers, that the world had finished with her. She would be wrong, he had written. Go up the mountain, the words said. Do not go down to the city to grow small and disappear. Go up and build and live. And whatever the stone gave back to her in the deep cold of the nights, she was to know that a part of it was him, still there, still trying to keep her warm. She could not read it a third time. The letters had begun to swim, and something she had held shut and barred for 4 long months came quietly, finally, open. She did not sob. She was not a woman who sobbed, but she sat there on the low stool, the fire ticking softly beside her, the small square of paper trembling in her fingers, and she let the tears come. Slow, silent, long overdue. He had known her better than she had ever understood. He had seen exactly who she was, and exactly what she would do to herself in her grief. And he had reached forward across whatever dark divide had taken him, and he had stopped her hand. He had not left her a blueprint. He had left her a reason. The chamber was not merely a shelter he had happened to find. It was the last thing he had ever given her. And it was warm, exactly as he had promised. And a part of him truly was still here, folded into every stone she had stacked with her own 2 hands. She sat with that a long, long time. Then she folded the paper along its worn creases and tucked it back into the book, into the place where the torn corner had always belonged. She pressed the 2 edges together, and though they would never truly rejoin, they fit. The book was whole again, and so, in some quiet way she could not have named aloud, so was she. She slept deeply that night, more deeply than she had since the day they carried him down from the mountain, and she woke to a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the stove. For 4 months, grief had been a locked room inside her, a cold place she walked past and did not enter. And now the door of it stood open, and the thing inside was not the monster she had feared. It was only love, his love, waiting where he had left it, patient as the granite. She was still alone on that mountain, but she was no longer alone in the way that hollows a person out. She rose, she fed the fire, and she went about the work of the day with something new moving quietly beneath her grief. Not hope, exactly. Something steadier than hope. Purpose. The change in her had come just in time, because the mountain, it turned out, was not finished with her. She felt the shift in the air 2 days later, before she was fully awake. Some part of her, tuned now to the moods of the high country, had sensed it while she slept. The still calm of the past week was gone. In its place hung a pressure, a held breath, the particular charged silence of a sky gathering itself to do something enormous. She had watched enough winters from the valley to read the signs, the strange yellow-gray shade of the light before dawn, the silence of the birds on the slope, a silence different from the ordinary quiet of morning. Something was coming, and so she spent that whole day the way her father would have spent it, in focused, unhurried, final preparation. She checked the clay seal on the pipe once more. She carried in 3 more armloads of the driest wood. She fitted a stout wooden bar across the inside of the door, into the bracket she had built for exactly this purpose. She melted snow and filled every vessel she owned with water. She counted her food and found it good. She did not hurry. Hurry was the enemy of care. But she did not waste a single hour either. By the time the light began to fail, she was ready. And she stood at the mouth of the chamber, looking out at a sky the deep and bruised color of a storm deciding to be born. And she watched the first slow flakes come drifting down, gentle at first, wide and lazy and almost kind. They lied. Within an hour, the gentle spacing had collapsed into a solid white curtain. And then the wind arrived. It rose across the afternoon from a low, steady push against the canvas door into something that had a voice of its own. A rising and falling note that climbed through registers as it found the different angles of the ridge above her. A moan. And then, higher and thinner, a kind of shriek. She lit the stove. She barred the door. And she settled in to wait out whatever the mountain intended to send against the small, warm place she had made. The storm ran on and on. She lost track of the passing of the hours. Time inside the chamber stopped meaning what it meant beyond the door. There was only the sustained roar above the ridge that never once fell away. The dark at the entrance that did not lift, even when some part of the day should have brought a gray light. And the fire, which she fed and tended, and never let fall to embers. Inside, behind her wall, in the great warm belly of the stone. She held. She fed the fire. She melted snow for water. She ate a little and slept in careful stretches, waking to tend the stove and press her palm to the granite wall. Warm, still warm. A part of it is me, still here. And she was not afraid. That was the thing she noticed, somewhere in the long middle of it. A woman alone, sealed inside a mountain, the whole fury of the season screaming against the stone over her head. And there was no fear in her at all. She had built this place with her own hands. She had measured every load. She had tested every stone before she trusted it. She knew, the way her father had taught her to know a thing in the bone, exactly what it could carry. And it could carry this. She whispered his words to the dark once when the wind was at its loudest. Go up and build and live. She had gone up. She had built. And now, through the worst the mountain could throw, she was living. On what she guessed was the second morning, she woke to a darkness that was different. Total. Absolute. The thin gray line of light that usually crept in around the edges of the door was simply gone. For one moment, lying there in the black, she felt the old cold finger of fear touch the back of her neck, the animal fear of the closed space, the buried thing, the grave. Then she made herself breathe, and she made herself think. She rose. She lit a candle. She took up the shovel she had left leaning by the door precisely because some part of her had known this might come. She unbarred the door and pushed and found herself facing a solid wall of packed white, rising up out of the dark an arm's length from her face. The snow had buried the entrance, the whole mouth of the fissure, the curtain of juniper, all of it. Gone beneath a drift the wind had driven against the ridge and packed hard as a second wall of stone. She was sealed in. She stood in the candlelight, looking at that white wall, and the fear rose in her again. And she set it down the way she always did. Panic was a fire that ate its own fuel and gave back no heat. She had no fuel to spare for it. She had anticipated this. That was why the shovel stood ready by the door. That was why the wood and the water and the food were all inside, within her reach. The storm had not trapped her. The storm had only finished sealing a door she had already built. She began to dig, not straight up into the endless drift, but forward and slightly rising, cutting blocks from the packed snow and passing them back behind her into the cold mouth of the chamber, carving a narrow tunnel just wide enough for her body to pass. It was slow, patient work, the kind of work she had become very good at. She measured her breathing. She rested when the tightness came low in her back, and she kept the candle burning at her feet the whole time, watching the small, honest flame of it, because a steady flame meant the air was still good, and good air meant she had time, and time was all she needed. She dug for the better part of an hour, and then her blade broke through into open space, and a shaft of blinding light and impossibly clean cold air came pouring down the tunnel toward her. She climbed the last of the way up and out, into a world she did not recognize. The storm had passed in the night, and it had remade the whole of the slope. Every landmark she had memorized was buried or transformed. The hard angular geography of the granite had been smoothed into a single soft and continuous white, drift heaped upon drift, rising to heights she would not have believed. The valley below had vanished entirely beneath a low gray ceiling of cloud. She stood at the mouth of her tunnel, in the small carved space between the drift and the door, and she breathed the brilliant frozen air. And she saw then what the snow had truly done. It had driven itself deep into the juniper. It had covered the entrance more completely than she ever could have with any material she had carried up that mountain. The snow itself had become the final layer over everything she had built. The mountain had not tried to bury her. The mountain had drawn a blanket over the small, warm thing she had made, the way a hand draws a quilt over a sleeping child. She almost smiled at the thought of it, alone up there in all that white and silence. Then she turned and climbed back down into the warm dark and barred the door behind her. Below, 3 miles down and a whole world away, the town lay silent under the same enormous snow. Its thin walls, its cheap green pine, its families crowded around stoves that had never been built to hold a cold like this one. She could not see it. She did not yet know what the long night had done to the people who had turned their faces away from her. To the children behind those thin walls, to the fires guttering low in the grates, to a young mother somewhere at the exposed end of the row, sitting up through the dark with a small child whose breath had begun to rattle. She knew only her own warm chamber, the fire, the steady breath of air through the crack in the ceiling, and the little book with its 2 torn edges pressed back together, resting where she could reach it. She fed the stove, and she thought, as the coals settled into their deep and steady glow, of the strange turn her days had taken. The valley had named her mad and looked away. It had left her to freeze or starve or simply vanish up here on the cold shoulder of the mountain. And instead, up here, she had found the one warm place for miles. She had found the last words of the man she loved. She had found, of all things, that she was not finished, that she had never been finished, that a whole life still lay ahead of her, waiting to be built, stone by stone. The people below had decided she was the one to be pitied. She pressed her palm to the warm granite, and she thought of the cold, tightening its grip on the thin-walled houses below. And though she did not know it yet, though she could not have known it, sitting there in her small, warm dark, the day was already coming when the valley that had turned away from the mad widow on the mountain would climb, cold and desperate and humbled, all the way up her frozen slope, not to save her, to be saved by her. But that was still ahead. For now, there was only the fire and the warm stone, and a woman who had been left for lost, sitting wide awake and unafraid in the heart of the mountain, more alive than the whole sleeping valley below. The great storm passed, and a stranger cold came to take its place. Not the wild, screaming cold of the blizzard. Something quieter, something far more patient, and in its own way, far more cruel. The sky above the ridge went a hard and cloudless blue, so clean and brittle it looked as though a stone thrown at it might crack it like glass. There was no wind now, only a vast, still weight of cold that seemed to have settled down out of some place far above the ordinary world, and it did not lift. Day after day it held, and the woman in the mountain felt her situation begin, for the first time, to turn against her. Her stove had held the chamber warm through the blizzard without much trouble, but this new cold was different. The great mass of granite that had been her salvation, the stone that drank the sun by day and gave it back through the nights, had cooled slowly to its very core across the long grip of the season. And now, when she lit her fire, the stone no longer only gave warmth back. It took some first. The walls drank the heat from her stove before it could ever fill the room. And so she had to burn hotter. And burning hotter meant burning faster. And burning faster meant that the woodpile she had built with such care, load by load, across all those weeks of labor, began to shrink at a rate that frightened her. She did the arithmetic one evening, sitting on her low stool with the book open on her knee, the numbers written in her steady hand in the margins of his careful script. At the pace the cold was forcing her to burn, she had perhaps 11 days of wood left. 11 days. And the cold gave no sign at all of breaking. She sat very still with that number for a long moment. She did not let it hurry her thinking into something less careful than the situation required. Panic was a fire. She knew that by heart now. So instead of panic, she made decisions. She lowered the warmth she would ask of the chamber. She would no longer keep it comfortable. She would keep it merely survivable. She pulled both blankets around her shoulders as she worked. She fed the stove less often, letting the room ride cooler between the burns. The savings were real. She recalculated. It bought her time. Not enough, but more. And time, she had learned, was the only material the mountain ever truly gave a person. Everything else you had to carry up yourself. It was on the 4th day of that deep and patient cold that the first visitor came. She almost did not see him. She had gone out to the mouth of her tunnel to judge the sky, wrapped in everything she owned, her breath freezing on the wool at her collar. And there, far down the slope, moving up the faint, packed line of her own old trail, was a figure, small at that distance, bent, moving with the careful, sideways gait of a man who did not trust his footing, leaning hard on a stick with every step. She stood and watched him come. She knew the shape of him long before she could see his face. Barnaby Rourke, the storekeeper, the one man in the whole valley who had not turned his face from her, climbing a frozen mountain in the worst cold of the year, on a bad hip and a borrowed cane. He stopped, breathing in ragged white clouds, when he was still a good way off. And even from there, she could see the thing his face was doing. He was revising something, some belief he had carried up the mountain without quite knowing he carried it. His eyes had found the thin curl of smoke from her pipe, then the squared-off mouth of her tunnel, then the canvas door set neatly into the living rock, then her, standing before it, whole and warm and alive. "By God," he said, when he had breath enough to speak. His voice came out rough, scoured raw by the cold of the climb. "You did it. You truly did it." She brought him inside. He had to stoop for the low tunnel, but once through into the warm rear chamber, he straightened to his full height and stood there, turning slowly, his hands loose at his sides. He ran one palm across the dry, stacked wall. He looked at the seal around the pipe with the long attention of a man who had spent his whole life judging the quality of other people's work. He looked at the wood, stacked by size and burn, and he went quiet in the particular way of a man for whom words have, for the moment, run out. "Spent my whole life in these mountains," he said at last. "Never once seen anything like this." He had brought things: coffee, ground fresh that morning, sealed in a small tin, a little parcel of dried apples, and he had brought news, which was the thing she had not asked for, and needed far more than the coffee. He sat on her low aspen stool, his hands wrapped around a warm cup, and he told her what the long night had done to the valley below. The storm had been savage beyond the ordinary measure of hard winters. Several of the thin company houses had taken damage. One had lost a whole section of its north wall, the cheap green pine splitting along the grain under the endless pressure of the wind and the cold. There had been emergency repairs, but the underlying trouble was the underlying trouble. The houses had never been built for a cold like this. Everyone who lived in them had known it since the day they moved in. And then his voice changed. It dropped and went flat, with the particular flatness of a man ashamed of the thing he has to report. "There's a family," he said. "Young couple, 3 little ones. Their house sits at the far north end of the row, fully exposed, worst spot in the whole town." She waited. "Their youngest," he said. "A boy, not yet 2 years old. Little fellow named Alder." He turned the cup slowly in his weathered hands. "He's taken sick. In the chest. Weeks now, since the storm. And that house. It never gets warm enough for a body to mend in. The mother sits up with him every night. Prudence, her name is. Prudence Whitlock. Won't leave his side." The fire ticked between them. "Their wood got buried in the storm," he went on. "The drift set over it hard as ice. Takes more strength to dig a stick of it out than a sick and sleepless household has to give." A pause. His jaw tightened. "They've started burning the furniture. Chairs first. They're on the table now." She looked at the fire in her stove. The stove that worked the way it worked, because she had understood what it needed and given it exactly that. The wood, stacked and dry and sorted, the result of weeks of her own methodical labor, done correctly. And 3 miles below, a child could not get warm enough to heal. The people who had turned their faces from her, The people who had let a soft-voiced man make her into a madwoman and had not climbed this mountain to ask her a single question. Those same people were down there now, burning their own chairs to keep their children breathing. She felt something move in her chest, but it was not triumph. She had imagined on some of the colder nights what it might feel like to be proven right in the eyes of the valley that had cast her out. She had thought it might feel like victory. It did not. A sick child felt like nothing at all except a sick child. "Tell me about the wood," she said. "The Whitlock's wood. How is the pile set? What kind of wood were they given?" Barnaby blinked. It was not the response he had braced himself for, but he told her. He described the drift and the way the pile sat, and the green, unseasoned wood the company had supplied. She asked 2 more questions. He answered, and then she had what she needed. "Tell Prudence Whitlock to come up here," she said. Her voice carried a steadiness with nothing performed about it. The steadiness of a woman who has already made a decision and is simply saying it aloud. "Not to ask me for anything. To learn something." She looked at him levelly. "There is a difference between wood that burns and wood that gives heat. And knowing that difference is not complicated, if someone will only show you." Barnaby looked at her for a long moment. It was an expression she had seen on him only once before, years ago, when her husband had shown him a rare and beautiful piece of crystal pulled from deep in the mountain. The look of a man meeting something that quietly rearranges what he thought was possible. She rose and went to her woodpile. She chose 15 pieces of the driest wood she had, the best of it. She knew each one by the sharp, resinous smell at the split face, by the pale gold of the grain, by the way it flexed instead of bending. She wrapped them in a square of canvas. "Start her fire with these," she said, pressing the bundle into his arms. "Dry wood makes a hot fire, and a hot fire will dry the rest of what she has as it burns. Tell her to come, and I'll show her the rest. Come back to me yourself if it isn't enough." He took the bundle. He held it a moment as though it weighed more than 15 sticks of wood ought to weigh. Then he nodded and folded himself back through the tunnel, and was gone. She stood a long while in the chamber after he left, listening to the silence his leaving left behind. The fire, the faint breath of air through the crack in the ceiling, the deep and settled quiet of the stone. The mountain did not care whether the child below lived or died. She understood that, and she did not resent it. It was not cruelty. It was only the nature of a thing so vast. The same granite that kept her warm was the same granite that had fallen on her husband. The same winter that could not reach her through her walls was the same winter now filling a small boy's chest 3 miles down the slope. She had not built this place to help anyone. She had built it to survive, to live, because a man who loved her had reached across the dark and told her to. The helping was an accident, a thing that had spilled over the edges of her own competence, simply because she was the one soul in that whole frozen country who had solved a problem no one else had solved. She did not feel noble about it. She felt about it the way she felt about the heat off the stove, or the good seal on the pipe. If a thing worked, you used it. And if a thing you knew could keep a child breathing through the night, then you did not sit on that knowledge and let the child struggle for breath. That was not kindness. That was simply not being a monster. She fed the stove, and she waited to see whether the valley would send her anyone at all. Prudence Whitlock came 4 days later. She climbed the packed trail in boots wrapped round with strips of sacking for grip, and her face, when she reached the mouth of the tunnel, held the specific exhaustion of a woman who had not slept more than a few broken hours at a stretch in weeks. She did not come with the manner of the town below. She did not come with the wariness, the sidelong looks, the word touched hanging behind her eyes. She came like a person who has run entirely out of other doors to knock on. She stopped outside the entrance in the killing cold, and she did not ask for anything. She only said, in a voice worn thin, "They tell me you know how to make a fire burn. Ours just smokes." And then, quieter, "My boy can't breathe in a cold room." The woman in the mountain looked at her for a moment, at the sacking on her boots, at the gray hollows beneath her eyes, at the way she held herself upright by what seemed to be pure and stubborn will. And she saw, in that worn and desperate face, something she recognized from her own mirror. A person standing at the edge of their strength, doing arithmetic they did not want to do, refusing to fall. "Come in out of the cold," she said, "first, then we'll talk about the fire." She did not bring Prudence Whitlock in to be pitied. She brought her in to be taught. She used a stick to draw in the packed snow just inside the tunnel mouth, where the light was good. She sketched a shape that was not a shape at all, but a lattice, gaps between every layer, room for the mountain air to move through the whole of it, even in the deep of winter. "Your pile chokes itself," she said. "Pack it tight, and the wet stays trapped in the wet. Leave it room to breathe, and it dries even in the cold." Prudence listened the way a drowning person listens for the sound of water against a shore. Then she explained the deeper thing, why the smoking fire never warmed the room. It was not that the wet wood would not burn. It was that the first work its heat had to do was boil the water hidden inside it. And until that water was gone, nothing at all was left over for the room. "You feel like you're feeding it and getting nothing back," she said. "That's why. You're paying, and the room never sees a cent of it. A stove can only ever give back what the wood is ready to give." She explained the signs of a fire hot enough to do its work, the clean draw up the pipe, the way the smoke thins to almost nothing, the point where the body of the stove grows too hot to hold a hand near for more than a moment. Then she went to her woodpile, and she took 12 pieces of her best seasoned wood. She stacked them in Prudence Whitlock's arms herself, arranging them so they would not shift and tumble on the long descent. Prudence looked down at the wood, and then up at the woman the whole valley had called mad. "Why?" she said, her voice cracked on the single word. "Why would you give me this? After what they've all been saying? After none of us came up here. Not once." The woman in the mountain considered the question honestly, because it deserved an honest answer. "Because your boy is cold," she said at last, "and I have wood that's dry. Those two facts belong together." A small pause. "The rest of it, what they said, what they did or didn't do, that's a different ledger. It can wait. Your boy can't." Prudence Whitlock did not weep. She pressed her lips together in the way of a person spending real effort to hold something in. She nodded once, and she turned and started back down the slope with slow and careful steps, holding the bundle of wood against her chest the way a woman holds a thing far more precious than firewood. The gratitude she could not say aloud was there in the care with which she carried it. After that, the valley began to climb the mountain, not all at once, not in a crowd, one at a time, in ones and twos, up the packed trail to the south face of the ridge, to the door of the woman they had all agreed to look away from. An old miner came, 3 days later, about the way his stovepipe kept clogging and choking his fire. Then a widow from the middle of the row, about a door that would not seal against the drafts. Then a young couple, new to the mountains, who had never in their lives managed a wood stove through a winter, and were burning through their whole supply at a rate that would leave them with nothing at all before the worst of the cold had even passed. One by one they came, and one by one she showed them. She did not gloat. She did not once say the thing she might have said. That not one of them had climbed this trail when it was only her own life on the line. And now here they were, wearing a path in the snow to her door. That would have been a fire, and it would have given no heat. Instead, she looked at each person's particular trouble, because every trouble was particular, even when the underlying truth beneath them was always the same. She learned their stoves. She learned their houses. She sent them home with dry wood and with knowledge, and the knowledge mattered more than the wood, because the wood would burn away in a night, and the knowledge would keep them through every winter still to come. The old miner, whose hands were too knotted with age to do the fine work anymore, began to explain the method to others on his own, down in the town, in his slow and certain way. She heard about it from Barnaby, and something eased in her chest at the hearing. The knowledge was moving on its own now. That was the thing about knowledge she was coming to understand. Kept in one place, held close and hoarded, it stopped working. It only did its work when it was passed from hand to hand. She had been a thing the machine of the valley did not need. Now the people that machine had failed were climbing a mountain in the killing cold to find her. She did not let herself dwell on what that meant. She thought only about what each person needed to know, and in what order they needed to know it, and how to say it to them without a single ounce of condescension, and without one word more than was needed. The cold had no patience for extra words. The cold laid every problem out with a terrible, clarifying simplicity. Solve it correctly, or suffer. She had solved it, and now she was teaching the whole valley to solve it too. But the deep cold went on, and her own woodpile went on shrinking. She had given away, by then, more than 60 pieces of her best seasoned wood. She did not regret a single one of them. But she was not a woman who ignored a ledger, and the ledger was growing thin. She recalculated on the 6th day of the cold. She had cut her own burning to the bone. She was living now in a chamber she kept just above freezing, wrapped always in both blankets, her fingers stiff around the pen when she wrote in the book at night. 7 days of wood left. And still the sky held that hard and cloudless blue. She did not panic. She simply added another task to her days. Between the visitors, between the teaching, she went back out onto the slope with her saw into cold so fierce it bit through everything she wore, and she cut more of the dead standing timber, and she hauled it up, load after load, the way she had at the start. She was rebuilding the pile, even as the valley drew from it. Her body protested. There was a bruise low on her back that would not fully heal, and a stiffness in her shoulder that had settled in to stay. On one of those hauling days, her boot found a patch of wind-polished ice beneath a skin of fresh snow, and she went down hard, her knee striking the granite beneath. She sat in the snow for the space of 30 seconds, doing the same cold assessment she had done with her split thumb, back at the very beginning. The knee was not broken. It would swell. She could still bear weight on it. She stood, shifted the log to a carry that spared the hurt leg, and finished hauling it up the slope. Inside, she packed the knee in snow, elevated it, and opened the book, and wrote in the numbers of the day, the depth of the cold, the state of her wood, her knee, a problem to be managed. She wrote all three as equal entries in the same steady column and turned the page. She had learned that a body was only another kind of material. You measured what it could carry. You did not ask it for more than it had, and you did not stop, so long as it still had something left to give. The cold broke on the 7th day. She felt it before she saw it. She had gone out at first light to judge the sky, and there was a softness in the air that had not been there for a week. A give. The hard, brittle edge of it had gone. By midday, the warmth had risen enough that the snow on the steepest granite faces began to loosen and slide, hissing down in small, bright avalanches, and the sound of it reached her inside the chamber like the mountain letting out a long-held breath. She checked her woodpile. 3 days left. She had held it, right to the very edge, and no further. And she had held it. She sat down on her low stool, and for the first time in many days, she allowed herself to simply stop, to feel the warmth returning to the stone, to feel her own exhaustion, honest and deep and earned. She had survived the storm. She had survived the deep cold. She had done what a man who loved her had reached out of the dark to tell her she could do. Go up and build and live. She had lived, and more than that. She had begun, without ever setting out to help the whole valley live along with her. It was in the gray stillness of a late afternoon, some days after the cold had finally loosened its grip, that she looked up from the fire and saw, through the gap at the top of her door, a different quality of light. Not the flat white of a snow sky, the low golden light of a winter afternoon that had cleared, and moving up the slope, following the line of her own packed trail, was another figure. She rose and went to the door and looked out. It was a woman, climbing steadily, and behind her, a little way down, came two more shapes, an old man with a familiar cane, and beside him, wrapped and bundled almost past recognizing, small and slow, but upright and moving under his own power. A child. She stood very still in the doorway. Prudence Whitlock reached the mouth of the tunnel first. Her face was transformed from the worn and hollow thing it had been. There was color in it now, and in her eyes was something the woman in the mountain had not seen directed at herself in a very long time. Not fear, not pity, not the sidelong wariness of the town below. He's breathing, Prudence said. The words came out of her in a rush, as though she had carried them the whole way up the mountain and could not hold them one moment longer. The room got warm, warm enough to sleep in, warm enough to mend in. He turned the corner 3 nights ago. Her voice broke clean in half. I brought him. I wanted him to see. I wanted him to see the woman who did it. And she stepped aside, and there, at the mouth of the tunnel, small and pale but steady on his own 2 feet, the child alder looked up at the woman the whole valley had once called mad, and reached out one mittened hand toward the warmth spilling from her door. The woman in the mountain knelt down slowly, minding her hurt knee, until she was level with the boy. She did not speak. There was nothing that needed saying. She only looked at this small living thing, breathing easily now in the golden afternoon light, and she felt the last of the cold weight she had carried beneath her ribs since the day they took her husband from the mountain. Finally, quietly, begin to thaw. She had come up here to survive. She had not known that surviving would turn out to be the smallest part of it. Behind the 3 of them, the sun was dropping toward the far peaks, laying its long gold light across a valley that had, for one whole winter, decided a woman was worth nothing at all. The valley had been wrong. And now, one climber at a time, it was coming up the mountain to say so. The winter loosened its grip by slow degrees, the way it always does in the high country. Not all at once, by increments. Each warmer day, a small negotiation with the cold. And as the snow began its long retreat up the slopes, a stranger came to the valley. He arrived by the road that had, for a season, led nowhere. A man in a wool overcoat far too fine for the elevation, carrying a leather case and the particular air of someone sent by people who sit behind desks and expect the world to arrange itself accordingly. His name was Ambrose Fell. He had been sent up from a distant office to understand why the mine below the ridge had returned so little across the hard months. A question of numbers at first. A column that did not add the way someone far away thought it ought to. He was a careful man. He did what careful men do. He measured. He walked the thin-walled houses and found the walls thinner still than any specification allowed. He weighed the fuel the workers had been given and found it poorer than the grade the company had paid for. He looked at the sickness in the town and at where in the row of houses that sickness had fallen hardest. And the pattern told him nearly everything he needed to know. Nearly, but not all. Because everywhere he went in that valley, sooner or later, someone spoke of the woman on the mountain. At first, he took it for the kind of tale that grows up around a hard winter. The sort of story cold and frightened people tell each other to make the dark feel smaller. A mad widow, some had once called her. A woman living in a hole in the rock, talking to a dead man's book. But that was not how they spoke of her now. Now they spoke of the fires she had taught them to build, the doors she had shown them how to seal, the child at the north end of the row who had been given up as lost, and who now ran between the houses chasing the meltwater, breathing as easily as any child should. Ambrose Fell had spent his career learning to tell the difference between a myth and a fact, wearing a myth's clothing. And this, he began to suspect, was the second kind. So he asked the old storekeeper to take him up the mountain. The trail was well worn by then. A whole winter of climbing feet had packed it firm. Barnaby led the way slowly, on his cane, and the man in the fine coat followed, and neither of them spoke much on the climb. The woman saw them coming from a long way off. She had learned to read the mountain's approaches the way she read everything. She stood at the mouth of her chamber and watched the 2 figures rise toward her, and she noted, with a small dry part of her mind that never fully rested, that the stranger did not talk as he climbed. Men who talked on a hard climb were men whose attention was divided. This one saved his breath and watched where he put his feet. She took that as a fair sign. He stopped at the entrance and looked at what she had made. The canvas door set clean into the living rock, the squared mouth of the tunnel, the thin thread of smoke rising true from the pipe, and his face, as he looked, moved through a sequence she watched without a word. First the skepticism he had carried up the slope, then something narrowing, sharpening, as a professional eye began to take the measure of the thing in front of it. And then, at last, something that settled into a quiet and unmistakable respect. She brought him inside. He had to stoop for the low tunnel, but in the warm rear chamber he straightened and he moved through the space the way a man moves through the work of someone he has been forced, against his expectations, to admire. He put his hands on the dry stacked wall, feeling how the stones locked one into the next. He looked a long time at the seal around the pipe. He looked at the wood, still sorted by size and burn even now, at the tail of the season, and then she offered him the book. He took it. He turned to the pages at the back, to the columns she had kept all winter, the warmth of the chamber against the cold outside. The wood burned against the days, her own steady hand, recording it all. He read for a long while without speaking. "You made a break for the heat," he said finally. His voice had the quality of a man naming something he had not expected to find. The wall stops the warm air from bleeding out into the cold mouth. The seal keeps the cold from finding its way back in at the highest point. And the door faces the winter sun. So the stone drinks what little light there is. He turned another page. "You kept a record. Every day. The warmth against the wood against the cold." He looked up at her. "This isn't a lucky accident. This is a thing that was understood." She said nothing. There was nothing to add. He had read it correctly. He closed the book gently and held it a moment in both hands. "Your husband was a fine observer, they tell me," he said. "The man who first found this place." A pause. "But he did not build it. He did not live in it through the worst winter this valley has seen in memory. He did not keep this record." He set the book down carefully on the flat top of the wall between them. "You did." He stayed a long while that day, seated on her low stool, asking the questions careful men ask, not to fill the silence, but to test what he thought he understood against what she told him. She answered him plainly. She described her decisions in the order she had made them, the reasons behind each one, the mistakes she had made and corrected, the things that had held on the first attempt, and the things that had needed tearing down and building 3 times over before they held at all. He wrote in his own small book as she spoke, translating her plain words into the language of his trade. She watched him do it, and she recognized that they were only 2 people describing the same true thing in 2 different tongues. When at last he rose to go, he paused at the mouth of the tunnel. "What I write will go back down to the people who sent me," he said, "and I want you to know, before it does, that it will not make comfortable reading for certain men in this valley." She understood him without needing more. What happened after it went, she told him, was not hers to manage. Her concern was what stood in front of her. He nodded slowly, and he went back down the mountain in the failing light. She learned the rest of it, in time, the way she learned most things. In pieces, carried up the trail by the old storekeeper. The report went down the mountain and out to the distant office, and it landed with a weight no one there had braced for. It laid out, plainly and without heat, how the houses had been built to a cost, and not to a purpose. How the fuel had been cheapened. How the savings that a certain superintendent had been so proud of had been paid for, in the end, by cold children and sleepless mothers, and a small boy who had very nearly not seen the spring. Cormac Thorne was not put out onto the road. Men like Thorne rarely are. The people above him preferred to avoid the noise of it, but he was sent away, all the same, reassigned to some small and distant and forgotten operation, a place with the same title he had held, and almost none of the power. The kind of quiet exile that companies build when they need a man gone, but cannot bear to say so out loud. She received the news the way she received the temperature of the stone, without heat, without triumph. The man whose soft voice had made her a madwoman in her own valley, the man whose cost saving had put a child's breath in danger, would go somewhere small and far away and manage something that did not matter. It was not justice. She knew that. Justice would have asked for something equal to the harm, and no reassignment could ever be equal to a winter of it. What it was, instead, was consequence, smaller than justice, larger than nothing, and she had learned, across that long winter, to know the difference between what she could build and what she could not, and to spend her strength only on the first. When the melt had opened the way, Ambrose Fell climbed the mountain one last time. He came alone now, moving easily on the trail, wearing a coat better suited to the elevation. Someone in the valley, it seemed, had finally given him good advice. He sat on the same stool, and he put a proposal to her, plainly. The houses below would be rebuilt before the next winter, rebuilt properly this time to hold a body warm through the cold. And what she had learned up here on the ridge, the wall, the seal, the sorting of the wood, the whole quiet science of it, they wanted it applied to the work. They were asking him to lead it. He was asking her to guide it. She was quiet a moment. Outside, the late light lay long and golden across the melting slope. "I'll do the work," she said at last, "on 3 conditions." He took out his book. The first 2 she gave him quickly, and he wrote them down without argument, that she would do it as herself, under a proper agreement set down in writing, and not on the kind of soft understanding that had once ended in a letter and a fistful of coins, and that the people who had climbed this mountain to learn from her over the winter would be offered paid places on the work because they already carried the knowledge, and a person who understood the work was worth twice one who did not. His pen moved and moved again. "Reasonable," he said. "Both." Agreed. Then she gave the 3rd condition, and this was the one that mattered most, and she looked directly at him as she said it, because it was also the one she thought he might resist. "The place where all this began," she said, "the fissure, the chamber, the whole of it. In whatever you write, whatever record this becomes, it is to be named as his work, as the discovery of the man who first saw what the mountain had built here." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. He is in your company's books right now as a casualty, a miscalculation, one tidy word. Set his name down instead as what he truly was, a man who noticed, a man whose noticing kept his wife alive through a winter that should have killed her. The silence after that lasted longer than the others. He is recorded as a man who died in an accident, Ambrose Fell said carefully, attaching his name to this place as its discoverer. It changes the shape of his presence in those records. It corrects the shape of it, she said. Not loudly. In the tone of a woman making a correction to a document. The tone of someone setting a crooked thing straight, not winning an argument. He looked at her a long moment. Then he closed his book and opened it again, and wrote for the better part of a minute. All three, he said. Agreed. She did not go back down to live in the valley. That was the thing everyone expected, and the thing she quietly declined. They thought she would descend now, take a room in one of the rebuilt houses, fold herself back into the shape the town had once cut for her. She knew it the way she knew the migration of the elk on the slope. Predictable, and in the end, beside the point. The chamber was where she had done the work that mattered. The walls were her walls. The stove was her stove. The words folded into the book were words meant for her alone. She would not store all of that away somewhere official and go back to being a woman in a company house. She stayed on the mountain. She came down to lead the work when the work needed leading. She showed the crews the sorting of the wood and the setting of a proper seal, and the small science of keeping a body warm in a cruel place. She worked beside them, her own hands in the same materials, the way her father had once worked beside his apprentices. Not above them, but among them. And under the low golden light of the lengthening days, the valley began, house by house, to become a place a person could actually live through a winter. On a clear afternoon, when the ground had softened enough to yield underfoot, she walked to the small rise above the north end of town, where the wooden markers stood. The first green shoots were pushing up around their bases. The bare trees at the edge of the rise were beginning, tentatively, to leaf. She stood at her husband's marker. She had brought a single flower with her, a small blue thing, the first she had found when the snow drew back far enough from the granite to let them grow. The same blue he had once drawn in his book with the care he gave to everything he loved. She set it at the base of the marker. She did not speak, not because speech would have been wrong, but because everything she might have said to him was already written, in the back pages of his book, in the columns of warmth and wood and cold, in the flower, and in the whole warm chamber she had built out of the place he had left her. He had left her a document. She had written her answer into its margins, across a whole long winter. Whatever conversation that had been, it was finished now, and it had been enough. She stood a long while in the spring afternoon. Below her, the valley went about its small, ordinary business. The change in it was invisible from this distance, but it was there, in the walls that would hold now, in the fires that burned clean, in a child who breathed easily, chasing the meltwater between the houses. She looked up from the valley to the ridge, to the dark curtain of juniper, just visible against the paling stone, hiding the mouth of everything she had made. A person who did not know where to look would pass beneath that slope and see nothing but mountain. She knew exactly where to look. She turned from the marker and walked back down the rise. And as she went, she thought about the strange arithmetic of the winter behind her. She had come up that mountain a woman the world had priced at a handful of coins, a widow, a madwoman, a thing the machine of the valley did not need, and did not want, and had agreed to look away from. She was going down at something the valley had no name for, not a widow, defined by her loss, not a worker, defined by her use to the mine, not a poor mad thing, defined by the fear of frightened people, someone made by her own two hands, out of her own materials, out of broken stone and dead wood, and the last words of a man who had loved her enough to reach out of the dark and tell her to live. The cruelty of that winter was not erased. She did not pretend it was, and she did not want it to be. The coins remained coins. The winter remained the winter. The man beneath the marker remained beneath it. Those were facts. They had the permanence of granite. But something new stood alongside them now, not canceling them, simply sharing the same ground. The way two things can share the same ground when one of them refuses to give way. She had built a home where she had been offered a settlement. She had built knowledge where she had been offered dismissal. And she had built, in the end, a kind of standing that had required the very people who dismissed her to climb a mountain in winter to find her. That was not consolation. It was not rescue. No one had come up that slope to save her. They had come up to be saved by her. And that, she understood, was a different thing entirely. Rescue asks nothing of the person rescued, but to be needed, to be sought out, climbed toward, learned from, that asked her to be exactly, fully who she was. She reached the bottom of the rise, where the old storekeeper stood sweeping the last of the winter's grit from his step. He looked up at her with that same attentive, undemanding regard he had given her the morning she first came in with her list. "Cart's still in the back," he said, "if you've need of it." She understood what he was not saying, that he had kept it all winter, that he had never once placed the bet against her. "I'll need it this afternoon," she said. "There's material to move." He nodded and swept the last of the grit away and went inside. She stood a moment longer in the golden light, looking up at the mountain that held the small, warm place she had made. The place that would go on holding, whether or not she was there to tend it, because that was the nature of a thing built correctly. It did not need her constant presence to remain true, and neither, any more, did she need the valley's permission to be exactly who she had become. She followed the old man inside, because there was work still to be done. There was always work still to be done. And she had come to understand, across that long winter of stone and cold and quiet, that the work was not a weight a person carried to the end of something and set down. The work was the thing itself. The work was the living.